Yorkshire, 1853. The oil lamp flickered on the table of the small surgery, sending restless shadows trembling across the peeling walls. Helena Dorset let her fingertips glide over the worn wood where her husband had tended to the villagers until his final day. 3 years had passed since Robert's departure, and still the room felt suspended in the moment of his last breath, as if she owed him the stillness in which she lived. The October wind whistled through the cracks in the window. Helena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked at the empty shelves where neat jars and clean bandages once stood. She wasn't a doctor. The law would never allow it. But she knew how to clean wounds, prepare compresses, and recognize limits. It wasn't much, yet it was all that remained of her, and of him. The door creaked open. A draught swept in, along with the bent figure of Mrs. Godwin. In her arms lay a small boy wrapped in rags. He didn't cry. He only trembled, his wide dark eyes fixed on some distant point Helena couldn't see. "Please, ma'am," the old woman whispered, her hands clutching the boy with more desperation than her voice dared reveal. "He burns with fever. I don't know what else to do." Helena rose slowly. When she took the child's frail weight into her arms, she felt the unnatural heat searing against her skin. Gently she loosened the rags around his thin neck, and then she saw something that did not belong to that room, nor to that child. A silver locket, worked in delicate filigree, far too expensive for anyone in the village. The metal caught the lamplight, glowing like a secret on the verge of being spoken. If you're still here, my dear, don't forget to support this story. Please leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I truly love knowing how far our stories travel across the world. Now keep enjoying the story. Helena knew the feel of true silver. That locket was no ordinary keepsake. Its polished surface shimmered beneath the trembling lamp, and engraved upon it was a crest. Subtle yet unmistakable, it had never belonged to humble hands. She lifted her gaze to Mrs. Godwin, who leaned against the wall as though every breath cost more than she could give. "Where did he get this?" Helena asked, her voice soft but steady. The old woman hesitated. Her fingers twisted the frayed edge of her shawl. "His mother gave it to him. Before she died, said it was all she could leave. That one day he would need to know where he came from." Helena felt the weight of that confession. She looked down at the boy, whose trembling had eased, though his breathing remained shallow and uneven. She dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to his fevered brow, studying the delicate lines of his small face. There was a stillness in him, an unexpected composure that did not match the rags wrapped around him. "How did she die?" Helena asked, still watching the child. "Fever," Mrs. Godwin replied with a weary sigh. 3 weeks ago. She worsened so quickly. And the boy. He had a fever too, but seemed to improve for a few days. I thought he'd recover. But yesterday it returned, and today I couldn't manage it alone." She swallowed hard. The tremor in her voice revealed more than the words themselves. "I'm too old, Mrs. Dorset. Old and tired. I'm sick as well, and I won't last much longer. And he—" Her eyes drifted to the locket, almost fearful. "He needs someone who understands the weight of what he carries. His mother, she seemed afraid that revealing the truth while she lived would bring consequences." Helena closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She knew exactly what such an object meant. It was not merely a piece of jewelry. It was a bond, a claim, a door that, once opened, could not be shut without cost. When she looked back at Mrs. Godwin, she found in the woman's tired eyes a plea deeper than any spoken request. It wasn't only for the boy. It was for something greater, justice perhaps, or redemption. A sudden unease brushed against Helena's chest. To involve herself might invite trouble, but to turn away, that would be impossible. She nodded slowly. "I will find who this locket belongs to," she said, her voice steady now, resolute, "and what his mother fought to protect until the very end." Chapter 1. The Weight of a Secret. Mrs. Godwin died 10 days later. Helena held the old woman's hand until the final breath, feeling the cold fingers slowly loosen, as if at last releasing a rope that had been gripped for far too long. There were no last words, only a look, long, pleading, that drifted toward the corner of the room, where William slept curled beneath a thin blanket, a look that said everything a weary mouth could no longer form. Then, silence. The village buried Mrs. Godwin on a grey November morning. Few people came. Helena stood beside the shallow grave, holding William's small warm hand as he watched the overturned earth with unsettling quiet. He did not cry. He did not ask where his grandmother had gone, as he had called Mrs. Godwin since he was very little, though there was no blood between them. He only tightened his grip around Helena's fingers with a strength that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than fear. When they returned to Helena's modest house, she sat him near the fire and prepared a bowl of hot porridge. William ate slowly, his wide eyes fixed on the flames. Helena watched every movement, the careful way he held the spoon, the slight tilt of his head whenever a log cracked in the hearth. It wasn't only the delicacy of his features or that quiet dignity that unnerved her. It was the loneliness. A child should not know that kind of abandonment. When the bowl was empty, she knelt in front of him. "William," she said gently, "do you know who gave you that locket?" He lifted a hand to his chest, where the silver chain lay hidden beneath his mended shirt. "Mamma. And did she tell you anything about it? About who else might know it exists?" William shook his head. Then his brow furrowed, as if he were reaching for a memory somewhere in the dark. "She said he was going to come for me. One day. When I was grown." Helena felt her heart tighten. That boy's mother had died clinging to a hope, or a fear, that might never be fulfilled, or perhaps it would be, and that made everything far more dangerous. She rested a light hand on the child's shoulder. "Let's see if your fever has come back, all right?" He nodded. She helped him out of his shirt, and then she saw it, high on his right shoulder, a dark birthmark with jagged edges, like a small, distorted star. Helena fixed the image in her mind. It was not the kind of mark one easily overlooked. Later, when William had fallen asleep wrapped in a blanket by the hearth, Helena lit a candle and sat down at the narrow writing desk. Before she began to write, her gaze drifted to the locket resting on a folded handkerchief. That afternoon she had taken it to the parish clerk, old Mr. Whitby, a discreet man, guardian of the region's records and genealogies. He had studied the crest with care, holding it close to the light, his brow deeply creased. "It's not often we see this here, Mrs. Dorset. It belongs to the Langfords, an old noble house in these parts." Then, consulting a worn volume he kept locked in the vestry cupboard, he had shown her the same insignia, a falcon poised against a silver field. "The family keeps residence at Langford Hall. Here is the full address, recorded from the last generation." His words echoed in Helena's mind now as she set the nib of her pen to paper. Her hands trembled for a moment. Any careless phrase could condemn William to contempt, or rouse the anger of a man whose influence reached far beyond the boundaries of their village. But silence, that would be the unforgivable choice. She drew a long breath and began to write. "Your Grace, I write compelled by a grave moral duty, aware that these lines may bring you some disturbance, yet guided by the conviction that the truth, however painful, ought not to remain concealed. There is at present under my temporary care a child of approximately 4 years of age by the name of William, whose mother, Anne Waverley, departed this life about 5 weeks ago in circumstances of great need and privation. Before her death, Miss Waverley entrusted the boy to the care of Mrs. Godwin, who, however, passed away only a few days ago, leaving him without any known relative or protector. The boy carries with him a silver locket bearing the crest I have identified as belonging to the House of Langford. In addition, he bears a distinctive birthmark upon his right shoulder, resembling a small star. I do not presume to draw conclusions beyond what the facts allow. However, I have judged it my duty to inform your Grace of the existence of this child and of the circumstances which appear to link him to the name you bear. I remain at your disposal should you require any further information. Respectfully, Helena, Dorset, village of Ashton, Yorkshire. Helena read the letter 3 times. Every sentence had been chosen with the utmost care, formal enough not to sound presumptuous, clear enough to leave no doubt about what was being said. She folded the paper, sealed it with hot wax, and wrote with a steady hand the address drawn from the parish record: Langford Hall, Yorkshire. When she looked up, she saw William asleep, his face peaceful in the trembling firelight. He seemed so small, so fragile. Something tightened inside her. An old ache kept in a place she rarely dared visit. She had lost a child at 4 months gestation, shortly before Robert fell ill. And when he died 6 months later, he took with him not only the love she bore him, but her last chance of becoming a mother. The empty surgery, the quiet house, the years that dragged on without purpose. All of it reminded her of a dream that would never be fulfilled. Helena closed her eyes and prayed in silence. She did not know if the Duke would answer. She did not know if he would believe her, but she knew she had done the only thing she could. That child deserved to know where he had come from, and he deserved, too, the chance to be something more than a buried secret. Chapter 2. The Ghost of Anne. James Hendrick Meredith, Duke of Langford, was in his library when the letter arrived. He hadn't expected any correspondence that morning. In recent years, nearly every letter he received had been an invitation to balls he had no intention of attending, pleas for assistance he rarely granted, or tedious reports from tenants whose affairs no longer stirred even a flicker of interest. His life dragged on in a grey monotony, rigid as the winter sky stretching beyond the tall windows of the estate. But when Peterson, his butler, stepped into the library carrying a silver tray with a modest envelope resting upon it, the air shifted, subtly, yet unmistakably. A thin tension settled across the room. "A letter for you, Your Grace," Peterson announced, with his usual flawless neutrality, "from a Mrs. Dorset in the village of Ashton." Ashton. A name of no consequence, a village he passed through without ever glancing out the carriage window. James took the envelope almost mechanically, yet something, a faint, shapeless dread, tightened in his chest before he even broke the seal. He opened the letter, read the first line, and the world he had worked so hard to keep untouched began to crack. Anne Waverley. The simple name struck him like a muted blow. James felt his body go rigid, his chest constrict. Anne. God. He had not seen that name written in more than 4 years. He had avoided it as though avoidance could erase the shame, the desire, and the quiet ache he had carried ever since she left. He had lived inside a practiced silence since then, numbed by duty, repetition, and suppressed guilt. And now Anne had returned, in the firm handwriting of a stranger. He read on, slowly, as if each line were a blade. "Passed from this life nearly 5 weeks ago." James closed his eyes, a shallow breath escaping him. Anne was dead. She had died alone, far from him, without his knowledge, without any chance for him to act it or to atone. Her memory, vivid, stubborn, brilliant, and painful all at once, washed over him with ruthless force. He opened his eyes and continued. "The boy carries a silver locket bearing the crest of the House of Langford. He also bears a birthmark upon his right shoulder, resembling a small star." The page trembled in his hand. The locket. The mark. The memory rose sharp and merciless. Anne holding the locket between her fingers, smiling as he fastened it around her neck on a warm summer night. The only gift he had ever dared offer her, back when he still believed the future might grant them more than hidden meetings and impossible dreams. And the birthmark. A distorted star on the right shoulder, a trait that had appeared among the men of his family for 3 generations. Not a hereditary claim, merely a strange coincidence folded into the private folklore of the Merediths. His grandfather bore it, his father as well, and James also. The letter slipped from his hand onto the desk. He ran a palm over his face, as if the gesture could calm the storm building inside him. Anne had borne a child. A boy of 4 years, and if that mark were real, if the locket had remained with her all those years, then the truth pressed forward with a force he could not dismiss. It was not absolute proof, but it was enough to break the fragile stillness he had forced upon his life. A bitter weight rose in his throat. Anger came first, that Anne had gone without telling him, that she had carried such a heavy secret alone. But anger quickly gave way to guilt, the same guilt that had shadowed him since the day she left, for the last time. The small rented house where they used to meet. A discreet place, distant enough that no rumor would reach prying ears. He had let her go. Not for lack of love, but out of cowardice. For the title. For the lineage. For the duties that had chained him since birth. He had told himself he was protecting them both, sparing her scandal, sparing himself public ruin. But Anne had left without tears, without pleas, only with her head held high, a silence that weighed now more than every word they had ever spoken. And now, there was a boy. James rose so abruptly that his chair scraped harshly across the floor. Peterson, waiting discreetly near the door, straightened at once, startled. "Have the carriage prepared," James ordered, his voice harsher than he intended. "At once, and without the crest, nothing that identifies the house." Peterson's eyebrow lifted by the smallest fraction, the closest he ever came to open surprise, but he did not question the order. "To where, Your Grace?" James swallowed, his throat tight. "Ashton." The butler bowed and withdrew to carry out the command. Alone in the heavy stillness of the library, James looked down at the letter lying on the desk. The air felt thin, almost sharp. He did not know what awaited him. He did not know how to face a child who might bear his blood. He did not know whether he would see Anne in the boy's features, and whether he could bear that. But he knew with devastating clarity that he could not remain here, not now, not after this. If Anne had guarded that secret until her dying breath, it had not been out of malice. It had been out of fear. Fear of him. Fear of the title he had once chosen over her. Fear that he would never accept what was his. James closed his hand around the envelope, feeling the cracked wax scrape against his palm. He would not be the man who turned his back on his own blood. Even if, in meeting that child, he would have to face the greatest mistake of his life, and everything he had lost, because he lacked the courage to keep her by his side. Chapter 3. The Duke's Arrival. Helena had not expected him to come so quickly. Only 5 days after she sent the letter, a black carriage, discreet yet unmistakably refined, stopped in front of her house. There was no crest on its doors, but the well-kept horses, the elegant lines of the coach and the straight-backed driver told the truth that silence tried to hide. She was in the kitchen preparing soup when she heard wheels approaching along the narrow street. The sound was different, steady, precise, nothing like the common carts of the village. Her heart tightened. She wiped her hands quickly on her apron and moved to the window. Through the glass she saw a tall man step down from the carriage with controlled, measured movements. The dark overcoat, the wide-brimmed hat, the firm posture made him seem larger than the space around him. He needed no crest. Authority followed him like a shadow. Helena held her breath. The Duke. The knock came, firm, yet not impatient. She removed her apron, smoothed the wool of her plain skirt with both hands, and adjusted her simple bun. She had no elegant clothing, and she would not pretend otherwise. She walked to the door and opened it. James Hendrick Meredith stood there, younger than the weight of his title suggested. Perhaps 35. Angular features, almost austere, with a mouth unaccustomed to smiling and eyes of deep, troubled green, marked by a weariness she recognized at once, the kind carried by those who have lost too much. And in a single, sharp instant, Helena felt her heart jolt painfully in her chest. William was his mirror, the same shape of the face, the same curve of the mouth, the same solemn stillness when observing the world. The resemblance was so stark it almost hurt. "Mrs. Dorset," he said, removing his hat. His voice was deep, restrained. "I am Langford." Helena offered a brief, instinctive curtsy. "Your Grace, please, come in." For the smallest moment he paused on the threshold, as if crossing that doorway meant stepping into a place from which he could never turn back. Then he inclined his head to avoid the low frame and entered. Helena led him to the small sitting room, where the fire burned in quiet embers. "I must ask your pardon for the modesty of the house," she said, keeping her tone steady. "I am not prepared to receive visitors of your standing." He looked at her with something that might have been respect, or simply exhaustion. "You called for me," he replied plainly. "I have no right to expect more than the truth." Helena nodded. His blunt honesty, sharp yet sincere, surprised her. "The boy is sleeping," she said, gesturing toward the narrow hallway. "He wakes easily. We should speak softly." James turned his face toward the bedroom. His fingers tightened around his hat, the knuckles whitening. "Is he well?" "He is. The fever broke 2 days ago. He eats little but enough. He doesn't talk much. He doesn't yet grasp how much he's lost." He closed his eyes briefly. For a heartbeat, the aristocratic composure faltered, revealing a raw, unvarnished grief. "You wrote," he began, his voice rough, "that Anne—" The name broke in half, barely audible. "That she died recently." "She did," Helena answered gently. "Mrs. Godwin told me Anne refused help. She wouldn't let anyone in. She feared the illness would reach the boy. She died alone, leaving him with the old woman." James pressed his lips together, his jaw tense. Pain crossed his face like a sudden shadow, too brief for anyone not watching as closely as Helena was. "She was always like that," he murmured. "Proud, strong, determined never to depend on anyone, not even on me." Helena said nothing. Some truths needed room to bleed. James lifted his gaze suddenly, sharply. "Do you know who I was to Anne?" "I know the locket belonged to you," Helena answered carefully. "And I know the boy bears a mark, one that, by coincidence or not, tends to repeat itself in certain families." The silence that followed felt weighted, almost tangible. James drew a long breath. "I need no further proof." His voice was low, steady. "He is my son. Blood knows itself." There was no shame in the confession, only devastation. A chill slipped down Helena's spine. It was rare to see a man of such rank admit something so immense with such clarity. "Why did she never come to me?" James asked, almost to himself. "Why let me remain ignorant for so many years?" Helena hesitated, but answered with the honesty he seemed to expect. "Perhaps she feared you wouldn't want to know, or that claiming the child would bring scandal. Perhaps she wished to protect him, or to protect herself." The words fell between them like stones. James dragged a hand over his face, weary. "And now he is alone." He lifted his eyes, and in them lay an unexpected urgency. "But he will not remain so. He is my son. I will not repeat the same mistake." Something inside Helena sank, then rose again. Respect, perhaps, or relief. "This will bring complications, Your Grace," she warned. "Society will not be merciful." "Society was cruel to us once already," he said quietly, "and I allowed it. I will not allow it again." A deep silence followed. Then, with a voice nearly breaking, James said, "I need to see him. I need to know him with my own eyes." Helena gestured and walked toward the hallway. She opened the door softly. William slept curled in his blanket, long lashes casting delicate shadows across his face as the cold daylight slipped through the window. James stopped at the threshold. He did not breathe. He did not move. For long seconds, he simply looked at him. Helena saw the exact moment something inside him gave way, not in a dramatic break, but in a quiet, irreversible recognition. His shoulders lowered a fraction, the tension dissolving as his breath lost its rhythm. Slowly, as if afraid to disturb the silence, the Duke took a step, then another. He knelt beside the small bed, bowing as though before something fragile and irreplaceable. His trembling hand touched the boy's dark hair, a reverent gesture, almost a prayer. "My God," he murmured, voice distant, drowned in memory. "It's like looking at myself as a child." Awe filled his words, and something deeper, pain, wonder, guilt woven together. But as his hand brushed the boy's cheek, William stirred, restless, and opened his eyes. A deep green, bright and familiar, shimmered in the half-light. James froze. The breath left him. "Anne," he whispered, the word breaking apart. "He has her eyes." Helena stood in the doorway, a silent witness to the meeting time had stolen from them, and she knew in that moment that nothing, absolutely nothing, would remain the same. Chapter 4. The Invitation. James did not sleep that night. He had returned to Langford Hall as the sky grew dark, but his mind remained in that modest house, in that small room warmed by a thin fire, in that narrow bedroom where his son had slept curled beneath a worn blanket. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face. Fine features, dark tousled hair, the fragile serenity of a child's sleep. It was like looking at Anne, and at the same time, like facing a reflection blurred by the passing years. He sat by the window of his chamber and watched the estate stretch out beneath the cold moon. He was grateful Parliament was in recess, and the season in London had ended. At last he could retreat to his property, away from London's watchful eyes and whispering tongues. Langford Hall was vast, silent, imposing, full of corridors that heard no footsteps, rooms no one used. Wealth, land, influence, everything a man in his position was supposed to find sufficient. That night, however, nothing felt like enough, because there was a boy, his boy, living without the name, protection, and affection that had always been his by right. And James knew with the cutting clarity of a blade that he was the one who had failed first. Guilt twisted inside him, alive and restless as a wounded animal. Anne had died alone, refusing help, shutting herself away from the world, guarding her child from scandal and perhaps even from the Duke himself. And why? Because he had not been there, because he had chosen the safety of his reputation over the courage of commitment. Because when she had gone, he had not dared defy the expectations that had shaped him since birth. And now William bore the cost of that cowardice. James sprang to his feet and began to pace the room. His thoughts raced faster than his steps. He had to bring William to Langford Hall. That much was certain. The child was heir to his blood, and James could not bear the idea of leaving him in a precarious home, no matter how honourable Mrs. Dorset's care might be. Yet to wrench the boy away from the only place where he felt safe would be a cruelty. Helena had warned him. William did not yet fully grasp what he had lost, and Langford Hall, with its cold grandeur and unfamiliar faces, could frighten him. James stopped by the window again. The moon shimmered on the distant lake, a pale, trembling line of light. Slowly, an idea began to take shape. He needed time. Time to win the boy's trust. Time for William to grow accustomed to him without fear. Time for Helena's presence to serve as a bridge between two worlds that never should have been separated. But how did one invite a respectable widow into a duke's household? How could he assure her there was no impropriety, no hidden motive? How could he protect her from the scandal of being seen in his company? There was only one possible path: formality, protection, and absolute clarity. James sat at his desk, lit the lamp, and took up his pen. He wrote carefully, shaping each sentence as if a single misplaced word might cause disaster. A formal invitation, a defined purpose, official stationery, the promise of a chaperone. When he finished, he read the letter several times. The words were firm, respectful, and made his intent plain. William's welfare, above all. But as he sealed the envelope and held it between his fingers, James felt the absurdity of it. A letter would not be enough. Not for this. Not for the woman who had carried his son's care on her shoulders these last weeks. Not when there was so much to repair. He extinguished the lamp slowly and left the letter on the desk. He would not send it. The next morning, he rose before dawn, his decision already made. Quiet but unshakable. He summoned his valet at once. "Have them prepare the light carriage," he said, shrugging into his coat with hurried movements, without the crest and as quickly as possible. The man did not ask questions. He merely hurried down the corridor. In a few minutes, James heard the stir in the inner courtyard, the creak of wheels being checked, the coachman roused from sleep, the footman seeing to the lamps and travel blankets. James descended the stairs before they had finished. The coachman waited, still fastening his gloves. "The village of Ashton," the Duke said, stepping into the carriage before the footman had fully opened the door. "And do not announce our departure." "Yes, Your Grace." The carriage set off under the pale light of early morning, steam from the horse's breath rising into the cold air. James's heart pounded as if he were making the journey on foot, the urgency in him greater than the distance. But as they neared Ashton, he ordered the coachman to stop. He climbed down and walked the last streets alone, hat pulled low, avoiding curious eyes. Discretion was essential. A duke entering a widow's house could ignite rumors fierce enough to scorch them both, and yet he was there. Because some conversations demanded presence, not paper, Helena opened the door before he could knock. She wore a simple brown wool dress, her hair pinned back with unfussy precision, and her eyes held a keen, guarded alertness, the gaze of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know that favors from powerful men rarely came without a cost. James inclined his head slightly. "Mrs. Dorset." "Your Grace." She gave a brief curtsy. "I did not expect your return so soon." "I must speak with you," he said. "It is important." She studied him for a moment. Then she stepped aside to let him in. William was sitting on the floor by the hearth, stacking bits of wood with meticulous care. When James entered, the boy lifted his green eyes, watched him in silence, and then returned to his construction. A fragile trust, but trust still. Helena came closer and folded her hands before her. "Speak." James drew a deep breath. Her eyes seemed to see straight through him. "I wrote a letter," he began, "but I came instead, because I felt I must say this face to face. I wish to bring William to Langford Hall, not at once, not permanently, not yet, but I need time with him. Time for him to know me, to understand who I am, and for me to learn," his voice caught for an instant, "to be what he deserves." Helena did not answer at once. Her gaze studied every nuance, the sincerity, the strain, the carefully veiled uncertainty. James spoke again before doubt could take root. "I do not wish to take him from you. On the contrary, I want you to come as well." Helena's eyes widened, not in shock but in careful assessment. "In what capacity, exactly?" "As his guardian," he replied, "as the woman responsible for his daily life, his comfort, his adjustment, not as a guest but with a clear role. You would stay at my country residence, not the main townhouse, and never without proper company." Helena drew a slow breath. "My reputation—" "I will arrange for a respectable lady to accompany you," he said firmly. "A chaperone whose sole duty will be to safeguard your name, and I will make it clear to the household that you are there at my request, out of charity, to care for a child whom I am morally bound to protect." Helena looked over at William. The boy was still stacking his scraps of wood with the quiet focus of a child who had learned far too early how to live alongside silence. "For how long?" she asked. "A few weeks, perhaps a month, long enough for him to grow accustomed to me. For me to begin to be," he faltered, "his father." The silence that followed seemed to fill the little room. Helena bit her lower lip, thinking. It was not only her own reputation that troubled her. There was the village, the makeshift surgery she kept in Robert's old practice, the people who knocked at her door for bandages, for herbal teas, for the small reliefs she could provide. If she left, who would tend to them? Guilt pricked at her, as if leaving that place meant abandoning in some quiet way what remained of her husband. Then she looked at William sitting on the floor, playing, small, fragile, carrying more than any child should have to bear. And so, slowly, she asked, "If I refuse—" Her voice was soft yet steady. "What will become of William?" James did not try to soften the blow. "I will take him regardless. It is my duty, but it will be harder for him, and for me. And I fear that I will fail him again." Helena closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, a quiet resolve shone there. "I have conditions," she said. James straightened. "Name them." "The chaperone must be a woman of integrity, not a spy, and I must have full authority over William's care. No decision is to be made without my knowledge or consent." "I agree," James said without hesitation, "and when this period ends, I return to Ashton. Without embarrassment. Without further obligation. Without questions." "No questions," he confirmed. "You have my word." "And when would we leave?" she asked. "I can send a carriage with a chaperone tomorrow." She turned her eyes to William. The boy had stopped playing and was watching them both with that quiet intensity that seemed far older than his years. Helena knelt beside him. "We're going on a journey, my dear," she said softly. "To a big house, with gardens and horses. Would you like that?" William looked at her, then at James, and then slowly he nodded. It was all the answer they needed. For the first time in many years, James felt something inside him loosen. It was not relief, not quite joy. It was hope, small, tentative, but alive. Chapter 5. The Country House. Helena had not expected the Langford estate to be so vast. The carriage passed beneath the wrought-iron gate and continued along an avenue lined with ancient trees. Their branches, stripped bare by winter, intertwined above the path like natural archways. William sat beside her, wide-eyed, absorbing every detail with silent intensity. Helena squeezed his small hand, feeling his cold fingers curl tightly around hers. Mrs. Phillips, the chaperone hired by the Duke, sat on the opposite bench, posture immaculate, expression serene. She was a woman of middle age, her manners gentle and her voice quiet, radiating a restrained composure that put Helena unexpectedly at ease. When the country house finally came into view, Helena drew a soft breath. James had explained that he would not take them to the main manor, but to the secondary residence on the estate, to avoid gossip at first, and to make her feel more comfortable. Still, secondary felt like an unfair description. The house rose in 2 stories of pale stone, with tall windows and an entrance framed by slender columns. Dormant ivy clung to the side walls, and the surrounding gardens, surrendered now to the chill of November, still held a quiet dignity. The carriage stopped. A liveried footman opened the door at once. Helena stepped down first, then helped William, who clung instinctively to her skirt. "It's all right," she whispered, bending low to meet his gaze. "I'm here, darling." The front door opened, and James appeared at the top of the steps. He had exchanged his formal attire for something more subdued, still elegant, but without ostentation. When his eyes met Helena's, he inclined his head, a courteous welcome that never crossed the line of propriety. Then he descended slowly, stopping at a respectful distance. "Mrs. Dorset, Mrs. Phillips," and then, softening his voice, "William." The boy buried his face in Helena's skirt. James didn't press. He simply signaled for the butler, an elderly man with a stern expression, to lead them inside. Crossing the threshold, Helena was caught by surprise. There was none of the cold solemnity one expects from an aristocratic estate. Fires crackled in several rooms, spreading warmth. Thick rugs softened the dark wooden floors, and the well-maintained furniture lent the place a sense of permanence, as if someone truly lived here, not merely visited for a season. Some of the tension in Helena's shoulders eased. "The rooms are prepared on the 2nd floor," James said as they climbed the wide staircase. "You and William will have adjoining chambers with a connecting door. Mrs. Phillips will be next door." He paused briefly before adding, "My own room is across the corridor. Should you need anything?" Helena nodded, recognizing the careful balance. Enough distance for propriety, enough proximity for responsibility. The rooms were spacious. William's in particular had been arranged with striking care, a small bed with a thick quilt, a low chest of drawers and toys neatly set out on a shelf, wooden horses, smooth-edged blocks, a cloth bear. How had he managed all this so quickly? Helena saw a faint light spark in William's eyes, timid yet unmistakable. "I'll let you settle in," James said, stepping back. "Dinner is at 7. Should you need anything, Mrs. Keats, the housekeeper is at your service." He left without waiting for a reply. Helena exhaled slowly. Mrs. Phillips touched her arm. "I'll be just next door. Call if you need me," she said kindly. Once alone, Helena knelt beside William. "It's a large place, I know," she murmured, "but we'll be all right here. I promise." The boy nodded, though his eyes still held a small, wary fear. She helped him out of his coat, and when she pointed to the toys, she caught a brief smile, a shy, almost forgotten one. He went to the shelf and picked up a wooden horse with both hands, holding it as though unsure it truly belonged to him. Helena sat quietly on the floor beside him, watching every movement. And as she watched William explore this small new world, her thoughts drifted, inevitably, toward James. It wasn't the wealth. She had expected that. It was the vulnerability, the weight of regret hanging on his shoulders, as visible as the fine cut of his coat. Helena didn't want to feel empathy, but for a fleeting moment she did. Dinner was strange, yet bearable. The table was far too large for only 3 people. 4, counting Mrs. Phillips. William sat beside Helena, perched on cushions to reach the plate. James sat at the head, keeping a cautious distance, though his gaze returned to the boy with every small gesture. "Does William eat well?" he asked, tone neutral. "He does," Helena replied, "but he's still getting used to having enough food." James closed his eyes briefly, as if her words struck something tender inside him. Then he nodded, heavy-hearted. "He will want for nothing from now on." Helena said nothing. She simply cut a small piece of meat and placed it on William's plate. The child ate slowly, with a wariness that tugged at her heart. After the meal, James rose. "There is a library downstairs," he said to Helena, "and a music room with a piano. The house is yours during your stay." Helena inclined her head in acknowledgement. For a moment, the Duke seemed on the verge of saying something more, but he abandoned the attempt and quietly withdrew. That night, Helena helped William into his new nightclothes, soft, clean, surprisingly luxurious for a boy like him. She tucked him beneath the quilt. "Would you like me to stay?" she asked. William nodded, small fingers gripping the blanket. Helena sat at his bedside and began to sing softly, an old lullaby her mother used to hum. Her voice trembled but held steady. William's eyes drifted shut. "Mrs. Dorset," he murmured. "Yes? That man, is he my father?" Helena swallowed the first instinct, to defer, to wait for James to decide the moment. But to lie to that child, she could not. "Yes," she whispered, "he is." William took a moment to absorb the truth. "Is he going to send me away?" Helena placed a gentle hand over his. "No, he brought you closer. He wants to know you. He wants to care for you. That I can promise." The boy closed his eyes again. His face softened, only a little, but enough to draw a quiet sigh from Helena. When he finally slept, she stayed a few minutes more, and as she rose to leave, she noticed a shadow shift in the corridor. James. He had been standing there, listening. And Helena did not yet know if that was a comfort or something far more unsettling. Chapter 6. The father he doesn't know how to be. James could not bring himself to draw closer, no matter how much time he spent at the secondary house. 3 days had passed since Helena and William arrived, and still he had not found the courage to start even a single true conversation with his own son. He watched from a distance, from the library window as William walked through the garden under Helena's quiet supervision, from the corridor whenever he heard her soft voice telling stories at dusk, from the half-open dining room door as the boy ate in silence, his shy attention fixed on his plate. And he watched her too, more than he should. There was something about Helena that unsettled him. It was not beauty in the conventional sense. She did not possess the polished elegance of the women who filled aristocratic drawing rooms. But there was a natural grace in the way she moved, an economy of gesture that hinted at contained strength. And her eyes, clear, direct, intelligent, seemed to see past surfaces, reading truths he would rather keep buried. She did not treat him as a duke. She treated him as the man he was, and that was both comforting and deeply disarming. He noticed, too, the endless patience with which she tended William, the way she knelt to meet his eyes, the instinctive tenderness in her hand when she brushed his hair, how she knew exactly when to speak and when to let silence stand. She was so effortlessly maternal that she made it look simple, and James knew it was anything but. Every time he tried to take a step toward his son, something stopped him. Fear, perhaps. Or the certainty that nothing he said would ever make up for 4 years of absence. How did one speak to a boy who had every reason to fear him? How did one approach a child who should never have been kept so far away? A child who did not know him, A child who knew only who he had not been. He felt useless. That morning he was once again in the library, a book open before him though he had not read a single line. Through the window he saw Helena seated on a stone bench. William, beside her, watched the sky intently while she pointed something out among the clouds, perhaps a late bird, perhaps only an excuse to distract him. There was a natural ease between them that hurt to look at, an instinctive trust, an intimacy forged in weeks of fear, fever, and loss, things James had never been there to witness. She knew how to be what he did not, and that knowledge gnawed at him. Half an hour later, the library door opened quietly. James turned. Helena stood in the doorway, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. She wore a dark green wool dress, simple, clean, and her hair was pinned up in a practical style. Nothing about her was superfluous, not her gestures, not her voice, not her gaze. And yet there was a calm, understated beauty in her that left him unguarded. "Your Grace," she said, with a trace of hesitation. "May I have a word?" "Of course." James closed the book more sharply than he meant to. "Is William well?" "He is." "Mrs. Phillips is with him. I needed to speak of something else." She stepped inside, leaving the door slightly ajar, just enough to preserve propriety. She kept her distance, back straight, expression attentive. There was tension in her shoulders, as if she weighed each word before letting it go. "What has happened?" James asked. Helena drew a steady breath. "Your Grace has kept away from William." The sentence landed between them with surgical precision. James felt the blow and tried to counter it. He began, but the excuse never formed. "I don't know how to approach him." "I know," Helena replied with gentle firmness, "and I understand why. But he notices. And children, even very small ones, feel the emptiness long before they understand the reason. He is afraid he isn't wanted." James shut his eyes, bracing his hands on the desk. "I want him." His voice came out rough, unguarded. "God knows how much. But I'm afraid of making him pull away, of saying the wrong thing, or worse, of hurting him." When he opened his eyes, Helena was closer than before, not enough to be improper, just enough to be kind. "Your Grace," she said softly, "you cannot hurt him more than life already has. What he needs from you now isn't perfection, it's presence." The words sank deep, simple, exact, undeniable. James drew a slow breath. "How?" he asked, in a humility he rarely allowed himself. "How do I to be with him?" Helena turned to the window and pointed toward the distant stables. "He watches the horses every day. He's curious but afraid to go near them alone. Perhaps you could take him there. You don't need to say much. Just walk beside him." James followed her gaze. It was so simple, so obvious, and yet it was something that had never once occurred to him. "What if he doesn't want to go with me?" James asked. "Then I will go too." Helena met his eyes. "But you must try." Every day you hesitate is another day he believes a little more that he is not wanted. It hurt, but it was true. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice unsteady, "for your honesty. That is why I'm here." She turned to leave, but he stopped her. "Mrs. Dorset?" She paused, inclining her head slightly in his direction. "You—" He hesitated, searching for words that would not sound overly sentimental. "You are very good for him. William is fortunate to have someone like you beside him." Helena studied him for a long moment. Her eyes seemed to pierce the Duke's facade and find the man beneath. "He is fortunate to have someone willing to try," she said at last. "Don't waste that, Your Grace." And she left the library in silence. That afternoon James finally found the courage. He went down into the garden, where William was stacking coloured stones along the low wall with Helena. The boy looked up as he approached and drew his shoulders in, a small defensive posture that cut straight through the Duke. James stopped a few steps away and crouched until he was level with him. "William," he said, in the gentlest tone he could manage, "would you like to see the horses?" The boy blinked. He glanced at Helena, sitting only a few steps away, and she nodded with an encouraging smile. "You may go," she said. "I'll come too." William rose slowly and moved toward James, but he did not take his hand. He simply stood beside him, like someone willing to try, but still unsure how. It was enough. James walked at an unhurried pace, letting William decide the distance. Helena followed a few steps behind. The smell of hay thickened the air as they entered the stables. Horses whickered softly, stretching their heads over the stall doors. William caught his breath, not in fear, but in wonder. James signaled to the stablemaster. "Bring Rowan," he said. Rowan was the smallest and gentlest of the young horses. The animal, a light bay with mild eyes, was led toward them. James stroked the horse's neck, then looked to William. "Would you like to touch him?" William hesitated. He looked at Helena. She smiled, and then, with short, cautious steps, he lifted his small hand and laid it against the horse's muzzle. Rowan lowered his head, as if he understood the boy's delicacy. William's eyes lit up. "He's big," he whispered, the first words he had spoken that afternoon. "He is," James replied, feeling something loosen in his chest. "But he's gentle, like you." William touched the horse again, and a shy smile broke across his face. Helena watched them, hands folded in front of her, her expression softened. When her gaze met James's, she inclined her head ever so slightly. "It's working." And it was. They stayed there nearly an hour. James spoke little. William spoke little, but they remained together, and for the first time that was enough. When they walked back to the house, William walked a little closer to him. He still did not take his hand, but he was nearer. And for James, that quiet shift felt nothing short of a miracle. Chapter 7. A Divided Heart. Helena noticed the change in herself by the end of the second week. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something subtler, far more dangerous, attention. An involuntary awareness every time James's steady steps echoed down the corridor. A slight adjustment of her posture whenever he entered the dining room. An extra glance, or two, at the line of his jaw, at those restrained gestures that revealed more than he ever intended. There was a quiet gravity in him that drew her in, not simple handsomeness, though he had that as well. It was the contrast between the man and the title, the way he sometimes frowned at the smallest difficulty, the hesitant care in the way he touched his own son, as if terrified of doing it wrong. Helena tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was only proximity, routine, the forced intimacy of shared days, but the truth insisted on being felt. He intrigued her, and that was a problem, because in just a few weeks she would be gone. That afternoon, seated in the library, she pretended to read as the November wind rattled the windows. That was when she heard laughter, light, unguarded, drifting in from the garden. She rose, drawn by the sound, and stepped to the window. Outside, William sprinted between the sleeping flower beds, his face lit with a joy that felt freshly born. James followed with long, deliberate strides, letting the boy believe he could outrun him. When William stumbled, giggling, James caught him with instinctive care. He lifted him once, not extravagantly, just enough to earn another burst of laughter. And then William hugged him. A simple, spontaneous embrace. And James closed his eyes, breathing in as though that small set of arms might undo years of guilt. The scene hit Helena with unexpected force. There was something sacred in it, something she had always wanted for William, to be loved, to be seen, to be protected. And now it was happening right there before her. Her chest tightened, not with jealousy but with a kind of sweet sorrow, because soon she would leave. And that daily rhythm, waking to William's footsteps in the corridor, tending his fears, watching him take those timid steps toward trust, would be gone from her life. What would it be like to return to Ashton and its quiet, to the abandoned surgery, to nights when no one called her name? Helena stepped back from the window, blinking fast to keep the sting in her eyes from becoming tears. She could not afford to break, not here, not now, not while the future was still a shadow. She was pulling herself together when she heard a gentle voice behind her. "Mrs. Dorset?" She turned. James stood in the doorway, William at his side, holding his hand with a new, effortless familiarity. "Your Grace," she said, straightening. "Do you need something?" "William does," James replied, giving the boy a small nudge of encouragement. William shuffled forward. "Mrs. Dorset," he whispered, staring at his shoes. "May I call you Aunt Helena?" The world seemed to hold its breath. Helena felt the words strike her like a blow of tenderness. She knelt, bringing him into her line of sight, and took his small hands in hers. "You may, darling," she said, her voice thickening. "I would be very happy if you did." The smile that blossomed on the boy's face was so pure, it undid her completely. He threw his arms around her, and Helena embraced him with her usual gentleness, but with a heart filled to the brim. She breathed in the scent of soap and grass and childhood, storing it, knowing it would one day belong only to memory. When she looked up, James was watching. There was gratitude in his gaze. And something else, a deep, charged quiet that made her chest tremble with an emotion she was not ready to name. He hesitated for the briefest moment, just one, then stepped back and left the room without breaking the spell. Helena stayed there a little longer, holding William, absorbing the sweetness and the ache of that moment, because she knew, the more she loved him, the harder it would be to say goodbye. That night, after William was asleep, Helena went downstairs for tea, searching for something that resembled normality. She did not expect anyone to be in the drawing room, but when she entered, she found James seated near the fire. The flickering light outlined the weariness in his face, a weariness not of the body but of the soul. He lifted his head at her approach. "Mrs. Dorset," he said, rising slightly, "please, sit. You are no intrusion." Helena hesitated only out of courtesy, then sat in the chair across from him. She accepted the cup he offered, trying to ignore the faint brush of fingers. Silence settled around them, dense, full of things neither dared speak. "He's changing," James said at last, watching the flames. "William, I hardly recognize him. He seems alive." "He feels safe," Helena answered softly. "You did that for him." James shook his head, as if the thought were more than he could accept. "So you understand him in a way He tightened his hand around the cup. "I still don't." "You will," Helena said, steady and certain. "He only needs to know you won't disappear." James lifted his eyes to hers. Vulnerability flickered there, a silent plea for understanding. "You have a gift," he murmured. "You say what I need to hear, exactly when I need to hear it." Helena looked away, warmth rising to her cheeks. "It isn't a gift, James," he interrupted gently. "Here, when we're alone, I would prefer you call me James." The name hung between them, something intimate, almost forbidden, a quiet invitation. She drew a breath. "James," she said, testing the sound. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if steadying himself. "You've brought peace into this house," he continued, "a peace I didn't realize was missing until it was here." "I only care for William," Helena replied, though her voice lacked the firmness she intended. "No." James shook his head slightly. "You care for him, and you care for me in ways you may not even notice, and that worries me, for when the time comes for you to leave." Her heart faltered. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a promise, it was simply the truth. And perhaps for that reason it was all the more dangerous. Helena rose before the conversation crossed invisible boundaries. "It's late," she said. "I should retire." James stood as well, bowing his head. "Good night, Mrs. Dorset?" She hesitated, just a breath. "Good night, James." He watched her until she disappeared from the room. Only then did he turn back toward the fire, as if searching its light for answers he did not yet know how to name. As she climbed the stairs, Helena pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady the quick, uneven beat of her heart. She had been bound to William from the first day, deeply, inevitably, and harder still to admit, she was growing bound to the man who was his father. And she knew with absolute certainty that when it was time to leave, it would break her. Chapter 8. The choice. James did not sleep that night. He sat by the window of his chamber, watching the faint moonlight ripple across the lake, while the house sank into absolute silence. His encounter with Helena in the library lingered in his mind, the unspoken words, the weight of what hovered between them, the growing certainty that the time they had together was drawing to an end. She will leave at some point. The thought tightened his chest in a strange, unexpected way. He tried to reason, or tried at least, but whenever he imagined Helena returning alone to Ashton, something inside him recoiled. It wasn't desire, it wasn't sudden passion, it wasn't love, not yet. It was need, not his own, William's. The boy had changed in a matter of weeks. Where there had been fear, now there was caution. Where there had been withdrawal, now there was curiosity. And Helena, with her calm, her steadiness, her quiet tenderness, was the bridge between them. What will happen when she goes? The question cut through him like ice. Before dawn, he rose. He needed to speak with her, needed to understand what she intended, what future she imagined, what role she believed she had played and might still play in William's life. The house slept as James walked to the chamber assigned to Helena. He hesitated, aware of how improper this was, but knocked anyway. Inside he heard the faint rustle of fabric, then soft footsteps. The door opened. Helena stood there in a simple robe, her hair loose over her shoulders. Surprise flashed across her face, quickly followed by concern. "James, has something happened? William?" "He's well," James said at once, lifting his hands. "I need to speak with you." Helena hesitated only long enough to acknowledge the impropriety. Then she stepped aside, allowing him in. James closed the door carefully, keeping a respectable distance. "Forgive the hour," he said, running a hand through his hair in a weary gesture. "But I've been awake the entire night, thinking about William, about you, about all of this." Helena clasped her hands in front of her. "And what is it you wish to know?" James took a breath, his voice tight. "What do you intend to do when you return to Ashton?" He didn't hide the strain. "How do you imagine it will be for him, for us and for you?" Helena lowered her gaze. For a moment he thought she would stay silent. But then she spoke, slowly, carefully. "I don't know." She released a trembling breath. "I've been living day by day since my husband died, and long before that since—" She stopped. James frowned gently. "Since what?" he asked. Soft, not pressing. Helena drew a deep breath. "I don't know if I should—" "You can trust me," he said without thinking, and only realized as he said it that it was true. Helena raised her eyes to his, and there was something broken there, something he had never seen before. "4 years ago," she whispered, "I lost a baby. I was 4 months along." A pause. He didn't survive. James went utterly still. There were no words adequate for such a revelation. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his voice unrecognizably quiet. Helena nodded, tightening her hands. "After that," she continued, "I never became pregnant again. Or perhaps I never had the chance. My husband died shortly after. I don't know, and—" Her voice faltered. "I convinced myself that motherhood was not meant for me, that God had decided that." James felt something crack inside him, not because he imagined children with her, that thought had never crossed his mind, but because of the pain in her voice, the wound she offered him without armor. "And then William appeared," Helena whispered, trembling. "So small, so fragile, so frightened. I had always wanted a child, and he had no one." She swallowed hard. "And my heart." She touched her chest as if holding something together. "My heart recognized him, as if he were my last chance to love someone who needed me." James felt his breath snare in his throat. She wasn't speaking of romance, not of him, not of longing. She was speaking of William. And that devotion, struck him with deep, steady force. She saw the boy not as a burden, but as something precious. "When I leave," Helena continued, her voice strained, "it will hurt, terribly. But I know you are his father. I know he needs you, and I am only someone passing through." James stepped forward. "You are not passing through." Helena looked up, startled. He went on, "I will not let him be wounded by another loss. And I will not let you pretend that your presence here has been anything less than essential. So I will ask plainly, how do you imagine leaving without breaking 3 lives at once?" She pressed a hand to her mouth, as if his words struck too deep, but she did not step back. "Then what do you suggest?" she whispered. "That I simply stay? With what name? In what position? Under what right?" This was the question he had come to answer. James inhaled, steady, decisive. "With my name," he said. "And in the position of my wife." Helena went pale. "No, that can't—" "I thought it through the entire night," he said, calm and clear. "This is not born of passion, nor of impulse. It is what seems right, honorable, necessary." Helena reached for the windowsill, needing its support. "James, a marriage like that would be convenience." "Yes," he said without flinching, "a moral convenience." He took another step toward her. "I cannot let you go and leave William vulnerable again. Everyone who enters his life eventually disappears. I'm not offering a romantic tale," he continued, voice low but firm. "I'm proposing an alliance, stability, protection for you, a secure future for the child." "And what would you gain?" Helena asked, her voice shaking. "Peace," James said, "and the knowledge that this time I did what was right." He hesitated, only slightly, before adding, "And companionship. Good companionship." Something I had not expected to find again. Helena shut her eyes, breathing deeply. I don't know if I can." "I'm not asking for an answer now," he said, stepping back to give her space. "Only that you think about it." A quiet pause. "And know this, whatever your decision, my gratitude and my respect will remain." Helena felt the tears rising, but she drew a steadying breath. "I will think." James nodded, a small gesture, but full of relief. He inclined his head, as if offering a bow. "Thank you," he murmured before slipping out. When the door closed, Helena brought her hands to her face and let the silent tears fall. Not out of pain, not out of fear, but as someone who had just been given a choice she never imagined she would have, a choice that could change everything. Chapter 9. The Promise of Tomorrow. Helena did not sleep after James left. She remained by the window, watching the darkness slowly surrender to the pale wash of dawn. His words echoed through her like muffled bells. "With my name, as my wife. Staying." It wasn't love. James had made no attempt to disguise that. It was a proposal built on responsibility, respect, and shared necessity. But what about her? What did she truly want? She thought of Robert, their quiet years together, their steady partnership, the soft mornings in the surgery. He had been her harbor until he was gone. And since then, Helena had learned to live with silence, with solitude, with the ache of a life stripped of purpose. And then William had appeared, and now James. James was not offering her romance. He was offering something different and unexpectedly precious, a place, a role, a life with meaning, and above all the chance to stay beside the child who had healed wounds she had buried long ago. Scandal would come, inevitably, but Helena had survived whispers before. And William was worth every one of them. When dawn touched the sky, Helena rose. She washed her face, pinned her hair, dressed with calm deliberation. She had made her choice. She found James in the library, still wearing last night's clothes. He looked as if he had aged 10 years, but when he saw her enter, he straightened like a man bracing for judgment. "Helena," he said quietly. "I've thought," she replied. "Thought a great deal." James did not dare move. Helena stepped closer, close enough to see the tension gathered in his eyes. "I cannot promise love," she said honestly, "but I can promise loyalty, respect, and devotion to your son." James closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing it. "That is all I ask," he said, his voice rough. "And I have conditions," she continued. "I will have autonomy over William's care. And if our life together becomes impossible, we must be honest enough to admit it." James hesitated only long enough to steady his breath. "I agree to everything." Helena studied him, the fatigue in his face, the sincerity, the unguarded vulnerability. Then she nodded. "Then I accept your proposal. I will marry you." James released a breath that sounded like relief and disbelief woven together. He stepped forward and lifted his hand, but paused, waiting. Helena completed the gesture. And when their hands met, it felt like sealing a quiet covenant. "Thank you," he murmured. "We'll make this work," Helena replied, "for his sake, and perhaps for ours." Telling William was easier than either expected. The boy was in the garden, nudging leaves with the toe of his shoe. When Helena and James approached together, he looked up, alert as always. "William," Helena said, kneeling before him, "there's something important I want to tell you." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm staying," she continued, smiling. "Not just for a few weeks, I'm staying for good." His eyes widened. "For good." "For good," James confirmed, kneeling beside them. "Helena has agreed to marry me. We will be a family." For a moment, William didn't move. Then he threw himself into Helena's arms with so much force she nearly fell. "You won't ever leave me?" he asked, voice trembling. Helena held him tight against her chest. "Never," she promised. "Never, my darling." James placed his hand on his son's back, completing the embrace. And in that simple moment, 3 fractured lives began to align. A month later, they were married in the private chapel at Langford Hall. A small ceremony, intimate. Mrs. Phillips remained as Helena's companion. A few trusted servants bore witness. Helena wore deep blue silk, without jewelry or adornment, only dignity. James slid the ring onto her finger. "With this ring I wed you," he said steadily. "And I promise to honor you, protect you, and build with you a home worthy of our son." Our son. The words made Helena's heart tremble. She returned the vow. "With this ring I wed you, and I promise to stand beside you and care for William as though he were my own." When the vicar declared them husband and wife, James kissed Helena with reverence, not passion, but a profound respect that felt like a foundation for whatever might come. William held both their hands through the entire ceremony, and when it ended, he looked up at Helena with shining eyes. "Are you my real mother now?" Helena knelt again, overwhelmed. "I am your real mother now," she whispered. "Forever." James watched, and in his gaze there was no fire of sudden romance, but something steady, reliable, filled with promise. That night, in the soft quiet of the resting house, Helena and James sat together by the fire. "I don't expect us to be," James began, searching for words, "a romantic couple. Not yet, at least." "Nor do I," Helena said gently, "but we can try to be friends, partners." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Thank you," he said, "for trying." "Thank you for giving me a new purpose," she replied, "for giving us a chance to begin again." They intertwined their fingers, no pressure, no demands, only a beginning, and they both knew their lives were changing. There would still be much to face, stares, opinions, adjustments. Their shared life would begin tomorrow. Society would eventually react. But for now, what they had was enough. Epilogue, 2 years later. Helena was in the garden when she heard the laughter. She lifted her gaze from the herb bed, thyme, chamomile, lavender, grown now not from necessity but from pleasure, and saw William running across the grass. He was 6 now, taller, sturdier, the soft roundness of childhood beginning to stretch toward the man he would one day become. Ahead of him, stumbling in her quick little steps, ran a small girl with dark hair and bright eyes, squealing with delight as she tried to outrun her brother. Anne Dorset Meredith, a 1.5 years old, named in honor of William's mother, a name James had insisted on preserving, not replacing. "Careful, William," Helena called, smiling. "Don't let your sister fall." "I know, Mama," he shouted back, catching the little girl and lifting her with surprising gentleness for his age. Anne clapped her hands, delighted, and William spun once with her, coaxing another burst of giggles. Helena felt her chest swell. "Mama." The word still struck her with a force she hadn't grown used to. For years she had believed she would never hear it again. After losing her baby at 4 months, after all the silence that followed, she had told herself motherhood simply wasn't meant for her. But then William had come into her life. And later, unexpectedly, almost miraculously, Anne. Hands settled on her shoulders. She knew the touch before she turned. "He's a good brother," James murmured behind her. Helena leaned back against his chest, absorbing the warmth and comfort of that familiar embrace. "He is," she said. "Because he had a good example." James kissed the top of her head, a gesture so natural, so at ease, that years earlier it would have seemed impossible. Their marriage had begun as an agreement, a careful, deliberate step. But intimacy had grown slowly, like roots deepening in the earth. Love had come after, not abruptly, but quietly, blossoming in every small act. "How was your morning in the village?" he asked. Helena sighed, though pride warmed her voice. "Mrs. Patterson asked me to take over the charitable society. She said a duchess who isn't afraid to dirty her hands is exactly the leadership they need." James gave a low laugh. "Imagine that. Society has finally decided to accept you." "Not accept," Helena corrected, amused. "Simply realized I'm far too stubborn to ignore." James smiled, that warm glint in his eyes that only she ever saw. "And you?" she asked. "How did things go with the steward?" "Productive. The fund for widows and orphans is progressing, and Viscount Hartwell suggested we combine efforts to extend aid to other villages. I believe it may work." "The Duke of Langford, daring to challenge tradition," Helena teased. "The Duchess inspires me," he replied, brushing her cheek with his fingers. Helena caught his hand, threading their fingers together. The simple ring on his finger, the same one from their wedding, gleamed in the sun. He had always said it was enough. It represented the beginning of everything. "Sometimes it still feels unreal," she confessed. "Having this, you, William, Anne, a home." James drew her closer, his expression softening. "It's real," he murmured, "and it's forever. I promised." A sudden shriek cut the air. Anne had slipped from William's arms. Helena stepped forward, but James was already crossing the garden in long, swift strides. He caught the girl before she reached the ground, earning a bright peal of laughter. "Daddy!" "Again?" Anne demanded, arms outstretched. James lifted her high and spun her gently, while she squealed with delight. William watched, glowing with pride, not a trace of jealousy, only love. Helena watched the scene, and tears rose, silent, warm, full of gratitude. Because this simple happiness, was something James had never imagined he would have. Something Anne Waverley had died wishing for her son, and something Helena, once a lonely widow, had never dared to dream again. But it was here. Real. Enduring. That night, after the children were asleep, Helena and James sat on the terrace overlooking the lake. The moon shimmered across the water, carving a silver path that seemed to touch the horizon. James held her hand, drawing slow circles on her skin with his thumb. "I thought of Anne today," he said quietly, "of how she would have loved to see William now." "She would be proud," Helena answered, "and at peace. Because he is safe and loved and happy." James closed his eyes for a moment. "I still think of her." "I know, and it doesn't frighten me. She's part of who you are, part of who William is." He turned to Helena, his green eyes luminous in the moonlight. "How was I ever fortunate enough to find you?" Helena smiled, her hand tender on his face. "It wasn't fortune," she said. "It was a chain of tragedies that somehow turned into a miracle. The locket, Mrs. Godwin, William needing someone, and the two of us needing a new beginning." James drew her close and kissed her with tenderness, a kiss filled with more love than any spoken declaration. When they parted, she touched her forehead to his. "We built something good, didn't we?" she whispered. "Something extraordinary," James replied. He wrapped his arms around her as the gentle night folded around them. And there, beneath the same moon that had witnessed their mistakes, their hardest choices and their broken paths, two wounded adults, and two children who deserved more than the world had given, found their redemption. They had found, at last, a home. Because they had learned that love did not need to be perfect to be real, nor sudden to be deep. It needed only to be honest, patient, and willing to grow. And theirs had grown, rooted itself, blossomed, and would never cease to bloom.